Maybe before I start, I should just take this opportunity to remember Carl for 1 minute. I think we all miss his presence in general, especially in these meetings. In fact, David was asking me about my beginning in computational neuroscience, and in the summer school that I mentioned, where I started basically becoming interested in neuroscience, one of the lecturers was Carl. And since then, I remember this kind of special mix of insight and humor, I guess, that we all remember. And it's very sad, of course, for me that I'm giving this talk after his not being with us. But on the other hand, I'm glad that we have this weekly occasion to remember him. So I was thinking initially of discussing some problems that we're working on cognitive questions, decision making and memory and so on. But then I realized that the audience here is probably much more interested in neural implementation. So I decided to talk about some thoughts we have developed on the nature of coding or possible scenarios of neural population coding. And I should say right away, before I forget, that really much of what I'm going to describe is work that was done with, and in fact by, a very brilliant graduate student, Simone Blanco Malerba. I wish I could, he's going to graduate soon, and I wish I could encourage you to hire him as a postdoc, but unfortunately for you, he already got a number of offers without even having applied, essentially. So I'm not sure how much chance you would have. We also collaborated on this with Yoram Burak from the Hebrew University, and in the initial stages also Mirko Pieropan, who was an intern in the lab, contributed to the research. So I guess we're all interested in how the brain makes representations, namely how does neural activity correlate with stimuli, or alternatively correlate with actions that neural activity supports. Of course, this diagram is very simple, doesn't have to be so simple. In general, the representation is influenced by the statistics of the stimuli. The actions we produce can have an influence on the nature of the representation as well as on the nature of the stimulus, because we're moving, and so we have kind of an active way of collecting stimuli. But these aspects will not be so important. We will think of a much more simplified kind of feed-forward setting in this talk. What will be more important is that I will consider very closely the variability in the representation, namely that these representations are not deterministic, but rather can be written as some mean piece plus some noise or some random variable. And so this variability will play a key role in the talk. So how do we go about, historically, how did people go about? You all know that one way historically that people went about kind of reading off these representations from data was to correlate some feature of a stimulus, like the orientation of a bar here, with the response of a neuron. And repeating this many times, this is from Hubel and Wiesel, I guess, repeating this many times, maybe not, maybe Kufler, I don't know. And you get a tuning curve which is bell-shaped like this for orientation selectivity. Similarly, for direction selectivity, which is another similar type of simple selectivity, you can draw tuning curves as a function now of the direction, the angle along which your bar is moving. And here you can see already that there is some noise, so single trials don't espouse this curve perfectly. This is some measurements that were made in the lab of Boton Roska, where you see that there is a big range of the single trial responses around the mean response, around the tuning curve. And so this noise will kind of hamper the precision of the coding. So one way to estimate, one way to quantify the accuracy of the coding is to replace a specific action which may be relevant in a task by this generic action, which is to estimate the stimulus, and see how well we can estimate the stimulus from neural activity. Of course, the estimate from a single neuron will not be very good, and in general, we'll be interested in the estimate from a whole population of neurons. So we'll collect responses from each neuron, calculate some estimate of the stimulus from the population activity and compare this with the true stimulus, and this error will be a quantification of how good our code is. Okay, so generically, you get more information when you have more neurons, and if neurons are independent, generically the precision, the inverse square error, will grow linearly with the number of neurons. This is very basic material. Of course, if neurons are correlated, this curve may change, may go down, but again, this is not something that we'll be very concerned in this talk, though if you want, I can comment on that too. So another way to think about this is to say, okay, if I have a number of neurons, I can, with these simple bell-shaped curves, like I have 3 neurons here, I can think of these 3 neurons as one mega neuron, if you want. And the amplitude of the response of this mega neuron will scale with the number of neurons. But if neurons are independent, the noise will scale like the square root of the number of neurons. And so the decoding, the signal to noise ratio will grow like the square root of the neurons. And so the decoding error should scale like 1 over square root of the neurons. Okay. So so asymptotically, as I increase the number of neurons, my coding error will go down, will approach 0, but will do so quite slowly. So this is fine, but if you think of this code, it appears at least that it's quite wasteful, and maybe the fact that this decay to 0 is so slow can be related to this wastefulness. So what do I mean by wasteful? I mean that if you plot the activity of these 3 neurons in the space, this 3-dimensional space of the response of these 3 neurons, and you plot the activity in this parametric fashion, where the color here indicates the stimulus, what you find is this one smooth curve. And so you're filling the space of possible responses in a very modest way, just with this one curve. Okay, and that might seem as a wasteful way to encode the stimulus. And indeed, there are observations that indicate that there are systems where cells will code in a less wasteful way. And the paradigmatic example that comes to mind is grid cells, on which probably some of you have worked. And there, where I have cells that have a multimodal response, in fact, in the case of grid cells, a periodic response, if I think of the tuning curve, if you want, in this space, I will get a curve that twists and turns and kind of fills this space in a much more efficient way. And indeed, through the work of a number of people like Ilafit, Yoram Burak, the lab of Andreas Hertz, and in particular, Alexander Mattis and others, we know that this way of coding can be very powerful in giving you very high accuracy with a moderate number of neurons. And so the starting point of this work for us was the following question, which is this a property of very delicately arranged periodic cells with maybe different modules that have some ratios of their periodicity, or is it a more generic property of kind of irregular or more complex tuning curves? And the answer that I want to give in this talk is the latter possibility, and I would like to show this with a very simple model. So the first part of the talk will be just to kind of give an answer to this question by looking at a very simple feed-forward model that can generate random tuning curves and estimate how well I can encode stimuli. Then I will try to make some connection with data by showing you an example where such a scenario, where one can interpret this example as incarnating such a scenario. And then if we have time, I would like to discuss some more kind of raw work, which is really work in progress, which is not fully digested, but in order not to get completely bored, I would like to present some of this, and I will be happy for feedback. So the kind of first part you can find in this paper, which we posted on arXiv, where Simone is first author. So of course, so our question is, if we make irregular tuning curves, what kind of code do we get? How good of a neural population code do we get? And of course, there are many, many possible ways of constructing irregular tuning curves. And so what we did is to think of a very simple way to construct them, and indeed to have completely random tuning curves. So we think of this as kind of a very simple benchmark where we don't impose much structure in those tuning curves. So imagine that you have a one-dimensional input, and there's a first layer of neurons that are sensitive to this input and are tiling the space of possible inputs and have some bell-shaped tuning curves. So you can think of these as your sensory neurons, like your ganglion cells, if you want, for example, in the retina. But then suppose that these neurons project to another layer of neurons via randomly weighted synapses, okay? So then what will happen is that the tuning curves of the second layer of neurons, that I'll sometimes call representation neurons to contrast them with sensory neurons, or first layer and second layer neurons, these tuning curves will be random because they will reflect the randomness of the synaptic weights, okay? Now, we will throughout be interested in the regime where n is much smaller than L, because we want to see if there is, so L is the number of neurons in the sensory layer, we want to see if it's possible to compress the information, or in other words, if it's possible to construct an efficient code. So we'll consider the regime where when L is much smaller than L. So as in the case of grid cells that I illustrated before, if you plot the activity of these neurons in this space made of, in the system of coordinate where each coordinate corresponds to the activity of one neuron, you'll find a curve that is kind of twisting and winding around. And the roughness of this curve will be controlled by the width of the tuning curve in the first layer, okay? So if I have tuning curves that are very selective in the first layer, I'll get a curve which is very squiggly. And if I have tuning curves that are very broad, I will get in the second layer a much smoother curve, okay? Now, to compare these different cases in a legitimate way, what we assume throughout also is that the range of activity, so the amplitude of the fluctuations of the tuning curves, is fixed as I change sigma. Okay, so each neuron has the same dynamic range if you want, but I will just change the smoothness of the curve by changing this sigma. Okay, so how does such a system of neurons encode information, or how precisely does it encode information? Well, it's quite instructive to look at the limiting case where sigma is very, very small. And so this curve is infinitely rough or infinitely squiggly. And so essentially you can think of this as taking a large number of stimuli arranged on your one-dimensional axis, and each one of them will be mapped into some randomly chosen point in the space of activity of the neurons, okay? Now, this is the mean response, but in any trial, you will have the response will depart a bit from this mean response. And these single trial responses are illustrated here as this cloud of gray points. And so if I want to estimate from a response what my stimulus was, what I will naturally do is to take the image point, the mean response point, the stimulus that corresponds to the mean response point closest to the response that I observed in that trial, okay? So if that's my recipe, what is the probability that I will make an error? Well, it becomes very simple. It's simply that the probability that there is some, if you want, a wrong point that follows in this area. And so the probability of making a discrimination error will scale like the ratio of the volume filled by the cloud of noise, by the noise cloud, to the total volume that is defined by the range of activity of each of my neurons, okay? Now, if I have L different stimuli that I want to discriminate, then this ratio has to be multiplied by L. And so the probability of error will scale as a function of the number of neurons, like this ratio of volume scales. And since it's a volume in n dimension, the probability of error will scale with the power of n, okay? In other words, the probability of discriminating between two stimuli will decay exponentially with n. So already here we see that there's a different behavior from the standard behavior that I described before of an algebraic decay of the error. And this behavior here is in fact similar to the behavior you find for grid cells. Okay. Now, this was a very rough scaling calculation. One can do a better job at calculating prefactors and so on. And then you get these lines which describe this kind of exponential decay. Each of these lines correspond to a different variance of the noise in the neural response. And you find that indeed the scaling kind of fits quite well with simulations where you explicitly calculate the discrimination error. What's interesting here also is that you'd find an exponential decay of this probability of error even for quite large value of the noise. So it's a very kind of very powerful, very efficient way, if you want, of encoding information. Now, of course, there's a price you pay for this. And the price you pay for this is that when you make an error, this error can be very, very large. And here it's very easy to see why, because any point, any given stimulus is mapped randomly anywhere in this space if I choose my synapses randomly. And so any error will be typically on the order of the stimulus space size. Okay. And so, yes, you can encode better on average, but the price you pay for this is that when you make an error, in this case, at least, it will typically be very large. It will be of the order of the system size, of the size of the stimulus space. And indeed, that's what you see in simulations. So these are some simulations of Simone where you look at the probability of having an error of a size delta x, where x is labels your stimulus space, and you see that it's mostly flat. Okay. So now what happens if I vary the smoothness of this curve by changing the width of the tuning curves in the first layer in my sensory neurons? Well, this curve will gradually become smoother. And what you can see is that, first of all, I will make the probability of these catastrophic errors less, because this smoothness will tend to repel the points of these curves away from each other. And the other thing is that because I will have some correlation, some smoothness in this curve, there will be some chance that I will make a local error. In fact, that there will be a noise in the response that will send my estimate to a point in the stimulus space that is near the true stimulus that induced this response. Okay, and so this is also what you see here, is that as I increase sigma, so remember sigma was the tuning width in the first layer, as I increase this sigma, what happens is that the global error, so this catastrophic error, which is very large on any single trial, goes down, whereas the local error goes up. So it becomes more unlikely to make an error which is of the order of the system size, but becomes more likely to make an error which is very small. Okay. So can we kind of analyze how these errors scale in this case, where it's a bit more complicated than in the uncorrelated case, in the completely rough case, but you can still make a scaling argument along these lines. You can think of this curve as a set of segments which are correlated. So a set of big points, if you want. And how many of those do you have? Well, the correlation is on a length sigma. And so each of these segments will be a length sigma, whereas the stimulus covers a range which in our case we just set to be 1. We chose the unit of the stimulus so that the range is 1. And so I will have a number of correlated segments along this curve that will go like 1 over sigma. And so effectively, instead of having an L here as a prefactor to my global error, I should have 1 over sigma. Okay. So this will be the curve that will be the curve that will give me the mean global error. So errors that are catastrophic, and this will be their average as a function of sigma. And as I increase sigma, I make my curve smoother and smoother, and so I decrease the probability of having a catastrophic error. And conversely, as I make sigma larger, I will make it more and more likely to have a local error. And we know how the local error scales. It scales like 1 over square root of n. So the square local error will scale like 1 over n. And it will also scale like the variance of the noise and with sigma squared, the tuning curve. Okay. And so what you see is if I add these two quantities, then I find a non-monotonic behavior. And again, the theory can be made a bit more precise. These are just scalings, how the different terms scale with the different parameters. You can make a more precise calculation, and you find a curve that agrees very well with simulations. So what does this mean? This means that for a given number of neurons in your second layer, in your representation neuron layers, or equivalently for a given size of your space, dimensionality of your space in which you're representing the stimulus, there will be some tuning width of the first layer which will be optimal. Okay, now where this happens, this depends, of course, on the number of neurons that you have, on the noise that you have, and so on. But this dependence, of course, is systematic. So here I'm illustrating what happens as I increase the number of neurons. And what you can see, as you expect, is that not only the error goes down, but also what happens is that this minimum is moving to the left. So the more neurons I have, the less I need that curve to be smooth. And so the more wiggles I can pack into my space, and the better I can encode my stimulus, okay? And intuitively, it's quite clear that if I have a larger space, I can allow the curve to twist and turn more without kind of intersecting itself. And so that's kind of the content of this figure, okay? So if now I plot for you the error as a function of the number of neurons for the optimal tuning width. So if I imagine that I have a neural system that can adapt its tuning width so as to be optimal for a given of readout neurons, then what you obtain is this exponential behavior of the error. So a much sharper suppression of the error than what you would have with regular tuning with bell-shaped curves and independent neurons. Okay, so basically the message here of this first part of the talk is to say, well, we can, with irregularity or with these kind of additional features, if you want, in the tuning curves, we can very, very efficiently encode the information in a much smaller space than the space in which it was encoded in the first sensory layers, even if we have tuning curves that are not very finely designed, like in the case of maybe grid cells. Okay, so is this something that is, I mean, I find this quite nice. Theoretically, it's very amusing to do these calculations, but is it at all relevant to any to true real neurons and to any of the data that we have? And of course, it's very hard ever to say if something is relevant, but at least what we can say is that there are observations that kind of can be interpreted in these terms. So I mentioned already grid cells that Ila has worked on, many others, I'm sure among you have worked on, and this is kind of an ordered case of a multimodal tuning curve. But in more recent years, there have been a number of observations of kind of irregular tuning curves with multiple peaks as a function of the input of the stimulus. Indeed, grid cells is one example, but in 3 dimensions, not in 2 dimensions. There are recent observations of place cells in bats in very large environments where people see multiple place fields that look quite random. There's also kind of examples of this in the auditory system with cells that are selective to multiple peaks in the multiple regions in the frequency space. But what I will analyze a little bit here is the example of motor cells in the monkey that also show these irregular tuning curves. And we had this data was posted publicly, so we could kind of look at it and try to interpret it in these terms. So the experiment goes as follows. You have a monkey which is seeing these virtual or holographic, I don't know how you'd call them, dots in three-dimensional space. You have a grid of 27 points, which are about 30 or 40 centimeter in height and in depth. So more or less the extent of the movement of the monkey's arm. And the monkey just, it's a static task. So the monkey just has to place its hand on the position of one of these dots, okay? And then motor neurons are recorded. Now you can immediately see that there's a difference in the setup. We considered only one-dimensional input, whereas in this case, the stimulus is three-dimensional, okay? So we have to generalize our theory. I don't want to go through this because of time. I don't want to go through this in detail, but we can generalize the theory to multidimensional stimuli. There are some subtleties, mainly that the sensory neurons now have to respond to more than one stimuli, and you can imagine different possibilities. So, and the two extreme possibilities are here. In one extreme case, any neuron is sensitive to all stimulus dimensions. In the other extreme possibility, you have these neurons break up in subgroups, and each group is sensitive to a single stimulus dimension, okay? And so one can study these different possibilities. And the analog of this image where you have a curve that is twisting and winding, and you change the smoothness of the curve by changing this sigma. The analog is you will have, in the case of a two-dimensional stimulus, a surface, and you're kind of crumpling the surface, and depending on the nature of the response in the first layer, the image will be closer to a surface that you're folding or closer to a surface that you're crumpling in all directions. Anyway, so one can kind of study this in more detail. One can estimate the kind of coding you get in these higher dimensional cases. I'm not going to describe things in details. These are analogs of the curves I've shown you before. And I'll just mention that it's somewhat non-trivial if you compare which coding scheme is more efficient, is better. You see that there's kind of a non-trivial. So this is the ratio of the errors in these two extreme cases, and you find that there's a pattern that is not completely trivial, where depending on the combination of the values of sigma and n, you may prefer one type of coding to the other. But anyways, this is just to illustrate that in the higher dimensional case, one has to think of some other subtleties, but basically, conceptually, the model doesn't change. So let's go back to our monkeys. And so the motor neurons that are recorded, so what you see here, for example, is an example of a recording where the warmer colors indicate more firing rate. So this specific neuron was firing more when the hand of the monkey was in these bottom positions. And the traditional way of modeling these neurons is that they respond linearly with respect to the hand position, or they're correlated linearly rather with the hand position. So each neuron, you can associate to each neuron in this description a preferred position, but it's rather more of a direction vector. And then the idea is that the response of the neuron will be proportional to the projection of the position along this direction, okay? And it's true that there is a subset of neurons that show a fairly linear relationship between the hand position and the firing rate. But there's also quite an appreciable fraction of the neurons that show a much more irregular nature of the response, where maybe there is some trend, but around this trend there is there are large fluctuations. Okay, and so in fact you can choose parameters of our model so as to fit the kind of statistics of the responses that you see in the monkey. And then you can evaluate the accuracy of the code and compare the two cases. So compare this case where you have irregular tuning curves and the case where you have these more linear tuning curves. And so that's what we do here. We evaluate, we quantify this comparison in terms of this delta epsilon, which is the % error improvement. So if this delta epsilon is positive, then you will prefer having neurons with irregular tuning curves. If this delta epsilon is negative, you will prefer having smooth tuning curves. And again, what you find is not entirely trivial. So this is the map that you find as a function of the number of neuron and the width of the tuning curves in the first layer. And what you see is that there is this separatrix in black that separates the cases with small tuning width or small number of neurons, where you're better off with a regular coding, and the case where you have either more neurons or broader tuning curves, where you'll prefer be irregular. So this is purely theoretical. One can ask, well, if you fit your model to the monkeys, to the monkey data, what does your model indicate? And this is what, again, Simone did by looking at the distribution of the variance of the responses in the monkey neurons, then sampling from these distributions to have a population of neuron that is comparable, at least in that dimension, to the neurons measured in the monkey motor cortex. And what you find is that as you increase your number of neurons, it's increasingly favorable to use irregular tuning curves. And this saturates more or less at around 100 or a bit more of neurons. And so the first conclusion to make from this is that given the parameters that one can infer from these recordings, at least it makes sense to have an irregular, irregular tuning curves rather than linear ones or smooth ones. The second question one can ask is, do these numbers make sense? And I don't want to make too much of a claim about these numbers, but it seems that the muscles that are the relevant muscles for this are receiving around, each muscle is receiving around this number of fibers. And so this number, about 100, is kind of consistent, at least with the kind of numbers of neurons that are kind of controlling individual muscles in this region of the monkey hand and arm. Okay, so, but this is more of a, I would say, of an illustration of how one can view data in the light of our ideas. So maybe, David, I have like 10 more minutes, or? Okay. So let me maybe skip this and just try to discuss a bit kind of the counterpart of encoding, namely decoding. So this is work that is really in progress. And when I say in progress, I mean actually in progress. So we're working on it. And so not all of these results and thoughts have been fully digested by us, but I kind of felt that it might be nice anyways to discuss some of these and at least give you a flavor of the kind of directions that we're thinking about. So I will not go in detail, but in the details, but I will try to give some flavor of the kind of questions we're pursuing. So so all this is very well, that I can have a code where I compress information and I have these random tuning curves, and I have very good encoding of my information in a very small system of neurons, very small population of neurons. But of course, the elephant in the room, so the obvious question to ask is, well, if you have such a complicated code, how will you decode it? So if you gain a lot by compressing, if you gain a lot of spikes and metabolic energy by compressing your information in a small population of neuron, maybe you will have to waste again all that energy just to recover this information. Okay, so is it a pointless exercise? And indeed, you can imagine that if you have to decode from such a picture, you would need heavy machinery to tell you which point is where on the line. Okay, so until now, all the quantifications I gave you were done by using an ideal decoder. And depending on the kind of loss function that you want to minimize, your ideal decoder will either calculate the mean of a posterior or the maximum of posterior. But anyways, you would go through calculating a posterior and then some reduced quantity obtained from this posterior. Okay. So it turns out that you can actually construct a neural network that will output for you an approximation to the posterior. And the way you do this is by choosing your weights in a way that depends on these synaptic weights, and by having an intermediate layer of neurons, which will each kind of describe for you the posterior at a given position X that you can associate with the label, the number of the neurons in this intermediate layer, which will be a readout layer from my representation neurons. Okay, so again, maybe I went a little bit fast here. The idea here is to say I have my sensory neurons, I have my representation neurons. These will output some kind of very irregular activity. I now want to construct some neural network that will read out from these activities. And what I'm saying is that if you're willing to have a next layer, which is quite large, such that each of these neurons will, if you want to monitor some small segment in the stimulus space, well, then you can construct the weights of this synaptic matrix in such a way that these neurons will represent an approximation, a discretization, if you want, of the posterior probability over the stimulus. And then by summing adequately from these neurons, you can retrieve some estimate of the stimulus. And Simone tells me that, in fact, you can learn those synaptic weights. So even though these synaptic weights are quite, are maybe a complicated function, that you complicated matrix that you have to impose, in fact, you can learn it. But so the point of this slide is that to say that in principle, it's possible to approximate an ideal computation, an ideal decoder with a neural network. And this neural network will not necessitate very exotic features. So there will be some nonlinear transfer function here, which will be exponential. There will be some divisive normalization, which are things that are viewed as plausible. And furthermore, you can learn these matrices. So it is in principle possible to approximate an ideal decoder. Now, there are two aspects of this procedure that are not very satisfactory. One is that you're willing to have, you must learn very complicated features. And one question is, how wrong would you go if you have small errors in the synapses that you learn, the synaptic weights, which is something we haven't studied for now. But I would say there's an even bigger kind of caveat to this setup, is that you have to have an intermediary layer which is very large. In fact, the precision of your decoding will be controlled by the size of this layer. And so if you want a very precise decoding, you will pay the price of a huge intermediary layer, which very much goes against the spirit of this approach, which is to say, can we compress information into a smaller system with less metabolic cost? So instead of constructing kind of an ad hoc network that will approximate what we want, namely an ideal decoder, we can say, well, can I take an intermediate layer of a moderate size and ask, can I learn my weights in such a way as to get a good estimate, no matter what this intermediate layer represents? And we know that if we take an intermediate layer, which is nonlinear, which has nonlinear units, and my stimulus size is compact. And so we know that provided we take a large number of intermediate units, we will be able to approximate well the stimulus, to recover the information, okay? A small difference from the typical function learning problem that is very similar to the setup is that in our case, we have noise in the output of the neurons. And so that any examples from which one would be training the networks will be noisy examples. So it's slightly different from basic setups, but it's not something that hasn't been studied. Okay. And so now the question doesn't become, can we retrieve this, a good estimate, or can we retrieve the information contained in this layer? The question becomes more, if I have a limited set of units in my intermediate layer and my hidden layer, how much of the stimulus can I recover? Okay, so if I constrain my decoder, how favorable is the encoding that I was proposing? Okay. So we are going about it in a very traditional way, in a very basic way. And so we assume that there is, we have access to a training set, to a set of samples, which are pairs of stimulus and neural responses, where these neural responses are noisy. We then find the parameters of our model, of our shallow network, if you want, by minimizing the empirical loss. And then we quantify the efficiency of the decoding through the generalization error, which is essentially just the error averaged over the various statistics of the various parameters that make up our model. Okay. So one maybe interesting avenue for thinking about this is that one can do some amount of calculation in the linear case. And in fact, in the linear case, one using some recent work in machine learning, in particular the work of the group of Ongler in Lausanne and the work of Jacot in his group, one can relate this problem to a problem of kernel regression. So essentially what the linear decoder now, so again, so this will be a case where this layer is linear. So in fact, I can forget about this layer because this whole transfer will be linear. And so I can just think of the estimate as of my stimulus as being given by some linear combination of the output of my neurons. Okay. And now these neurons, each of these tuning curves is a realization of some random process, which in our case, since we have Gaussian, which in our case is simply a Gaussian process, okay, where the kernel of the Gaussian process is controlled by this tuning curve and by the size sigma. Okay, and so basically what we're saying here is, can I reconstruct the stimulus? So can I reconstruct this function, which is f of x is equal to x? Can I learn this function by fitting it by a sum of a realization of Gaussian processes? Okay, and these people have shown that you can, this indeed is an approximation to a kernel learning problem, where the kernel that you're using is the kernel of the Gaussian process. And so you can relate, you can establish bounds between the two problems and solve one of the problems. And so for the linear case, you can have some analytical understanding of the features of this solution. So let me illustrate what happens. So here is how the generalization error behaves as you're learned, as a function of the size of your training set. Okay, and so as you see, it goes down. But what happens is that if you decrease sigma, so if you make your first layer of neuron, your sensory layer, more selective, the generalization error increases. And conversely, if you make sigma smaller, sorry, larger, so if you make your tuning smoother, less selective, then the generalization error drops more. Okay, so another way to plot this data is to plot the data so to plot the generalization error as a function of sigma, as a function of the smoothness of the code for different sizes of the training set. So you can think of this of how, how things evolve as you're learning. For example, if you're learning online and you're having more and more examples. Okay, and here the lines and the dot are comparisons between simulations where we actually just calculate, Simone just calculated this generalization error, and bounds that you can establish along the line of work of these people, of this group, bounds that you can establish for this, for the generalization error by relating it to a kernel regression problem. Okay, so what you see here is kind of, in a sense, the opposite of what I was saying before, is that you will not want to have a very small sigma to make your system be efficient, but you will prefer having large sigmas. Okay. Now, this is not so surprising for a linear system, because all you can do with a linear system is to project your neural activity along some dimensions. And obviously, when I have twisting and turning, I will never be able to recover the information unless this twisting and turning is so smooth that will be one direction that will really be very expressive of the whole curve. Okay, but presumably this scenario doesn't have to extend to the case where the intermediary layer has a nonlinear transfer function. And indeed, what you find here is that, okay, so maybe before I go a bit more in detail, this is just an illustration of what happens if I take an intermediary layer with a fixed number of neurons, and now I look at how the generalization error changes as a function of n, so as a function of my population in the previous layer. So the bigger n, of course, the more accurate is the information encoded in the representation layer, in this layer. But what I will see is that at some point I saturate. So beyond some threshold, beyond some crossover, sorry, value of n, it will not be favorable to increase the number of my neurons in my intermediary layer. Let me see, because I have some chat. Okay, so David is telling me 4 minutes. Okay, so let me see. Okay, so let me, what's happening? Yeah. Okay, so okay, so maybe right. So another way to represent this, what's happening is that suppose that I fix m now. So here I was looking for different values of m and increasing n. Okay. Now suppose that I fix n and m, and I ask what happens if I change sigma. Okay. So do I want a code which is very accurate, which I would obtain if n is large enough by changing the sigma and making it small? And what you can see is that indeed the case with nonlinear units here, which is this green curve, is much better. The generalization error is much lower than in the linear decoder case. And in fact, it's quite close to the ideal decoder, okay? But below some sigma, it departs for the ideal decoder. And in fact, the generalization error increases, okay? So a more exhaustive view of this, which is happening, is you see these similar curves here plotted as a function of sigma, again, the generalization error as a function of sigma for different sizes of this intermediary layer, okay? So what happens is that as I make my intermediary layer larger and larger, I will recover more and more information. So my decoder will become more and more accurate. But there will be, for any given size of my intermediary layer, there will be some sigma which will be optimal, and this value of the optimal sigma is going down as I increase my intermediary layer, as one would expect. But the main point here is that there is this non-trivial optimum. Okay, so there will be some sigma for which my decoder will work best at a given value of m, which is the size of my intermediary layer. So let me just maybe shed some light on this, and then I will conclude. Basically, if you have a curve like this, so these curves were the curves that illustrated our code, and we said that sigma will govern the correlation length in this curve. And so I can think of this curve as being made up of a bunch of segments, of smooth segments of size sigma. Okay, and so I have a number 1 over sigma again of these segments, and I can, each of these hidden layer neurons will record a projection of that curve along a direction. And so if I have 1 over sigma segments that point in some direction, I can imagine that I will want to have around 1 over sigma intermediary units. Okay, and if I have, and so for a given number of intermediary units, there will be some sigma that will be optimal, but if I go below that sigma, then I don't have enough intermediary units to kind of read off different segments from this curve. Okay, so that's kind of one intuitive image maybe that can explain these curves, the behavior of these curves. Okay, so let me just skip all this, and just before concluding, I want to mention that as we were working on this a bit after, we realized that some of it had been done by Shannon in a very beautiful paper, which he published, I think, after his famous paper, but that he wrote much before. He wrote it several years before, and it concerns the communication of the transmission of a continuous signal, not of a discrete signal. And basically, he develops a very similar idea. And he says, well, if you take a signal which is continuous, so you can label it by a line, well, then if you have noise in your transmission, then you're better off expanding this line into a much longer line, stretching this line and kind of folding it into the space in which you will send it, so that the noise will corrupt it less. And he has a very beautiful description where he describes that if this noise becomes too large, then you'll hit what he calls a threshold and you'll have catastrophic errors. And then he goes on to actually develop the model for a random code, which corresponds actually quite closely to the very first case that I showed you, where all points were uncorrelated from one another. And so you could view our simple network as a bit of an extension on this, where we admit having sigmas that are not very close to 0. Okay, so let me just conclude with very brief comments. So the first point that I made, I think, was that if you have irregular tuning curves or multimodal tuning curves, they can serve to compress the information contained in a continuous stimulus from a high dimensional representation to a low dimensional one. That then one can look for an optimal compression, and one can think of this as kind of an efficient coding problem. Now, normally efficient coding problems are described for a single population of, say, peripheral neurons. So you're asking, how should I choose my tuning width or the distribution of the arrangement of neurons so as to maximize information transfer by a single layer? What we do here is something slightly different, which is to say, how should I choose properties of a given layer of neurons in a given layer if I have constraints on the next layer? Okay, so it's kind of a 2-layer version of an efficient coding problem from which you can derive an optimal sigma, and so an optimal compression. At that optimal compression, you have very precise encoding of information. You have an exponentially decaying code, but the price that you pay, as I mentioned, was that you have occasionally catastrophic errors. And finally, I tried to argue, though somewhat superficially for now, but I tried to argue by showing you some illustration of results that one ought to consider the problem not only from the point of view of encoding, but jointly from the point of view of encoding and decoding. And that if one has a limited machinery for the decoder, if one has constraints on the decoders, then this will influence the optimization of the encoder, which is, I think, a very, very simple idea, very trivial idea, but not an idea that has been explored maybe as much as it should until now. Okay, thank you very much.